Welcome to The Political Animals, a show where two political philosophers, one a right-wing radical, the other a left-wing heretic, come together to discuss the social, political and cultural issues of the day. I'm Jonathan Cole, one of those philosophers, and the other is Holly Lawford Smith. How are you going, Holly?
I think I'm going well, but I haven't really thought about it today.
It's a very complex question. Don't ask me or I'll have to think about it as well.
Introspecting our levels of flourishing and well-being. Yeah.
Said in the most deadpan manner I've ever heard for someone who's flourishing in well-being. Now, we are really not either of us small talkers as far as I can see, in spite of that little small talk we did for the sake of the art of podcasting and YouTubing. So let's dive straight into it. Now, you're the left-wing heretic of this show, and the question I want to ask you is why left-wing and why heretic?
Yes. I spent the morning before we started recording on a range of different websites where you enter all of your beliefs and preferences, and it spits out for you who you should vote for, what party you should vote for. So I'm a registered voter in New Zealand. I'm a permanent citizen of Australia, but we can't vote here, so I vote in New Zealand. And man, those things are complicated. Like, do I have a complex, nuanced understanding of the pros and cons of the charter school debate? No. So I found there's quite a lot of questions where I had to just put don't know or skip. But yeah, that's kind of my approach to whether or not I am left-wing and which of the parties I should vote for and how they are coded in terms of the left-right political spectrum. So unfortunately, because I used multiple websites, I got different answers as to where I am located and what party best suits me. But in general, two of the kind of most best empirically supported websites, so the ones that have the backing of like two major universities and are done by political scientists, sort of put me at the what you might call the top left quadrant. So if you get a four-quadrant way of thinking about politics in terms of your social versus economic. How did they do it? One did social, economic, and authoritarian liberal, or whatever they called the other one. And then so I was kind of close to the center, but in the leftish quadrant for each of those. So that's why I think of myself as a leftist, despite maybe not having like all the correct views that other people that think of themselves as left-wing have.
So the heretic bit, I mean, I can take a guess at one particular issue where you have courted some controversy and some fame or infamy, depending on one's perspective, where you have really challenged what seems to be a kind of core idea on the left these days, and that's around the transgender question. Would that be the part of your political philosophy that makes you a heretic, or does it go beyond that one issue?
I think it goes beyond it, actually, and it was really helpful for me to spend a few hours this morning like really looking at all those sets of policy issues that one might care about and that parties have different platforms on and approaches to, because it made me appreciate more like how much I sort of swing wildly on some things between what the approved sort of tribal left position versus the tribal right positions are. So the thing that's really salient to me, of course, is the like within feminism having the wrong opinions on like sex work, trans issues, intersectionality and so on. But yeah, I think within the wider left, just going through like things on housing and things on the place of the Treaty of Waitangi and, once you really go through all of that and you notice that you're like, wow, I'm like weirdly liberal about drugs, but I'm not totally sure that the economic arguments support like getting way beyond the 40% tax on the rich. Like, so that these are all complex empirical questions. And I noticed that it was hard for the websites to end up classifying me well, or sometimes for one of them, my highest match with any party was like 66%. And I think that's because, yeah, there's positions that would tend to be like tribe right, where I agree with them. Like I'm on free speech, I tend to be like very non-interventionist. But then I think I do have some like bleeding heart style impulses for like school lunches for everyone, because that's really good for poverty relief and so on. So I sort of realized that I've got like heretical views, I guess, on more things than are salient to me on a daily basis, because the salient things tend to be about feminism.
But did the kind of various formulas that you tested out, you mentioned that some of them, or one of them at least, was actually recommending a party for you to vote. I don't know if you want to actually mention the parties or not, but even if you don't, were those parties on the left the ones that they said most closely match your policy preferences?
Yeah, so there are three different websites. One that says it's like hasn't been updated since 2019, and the person themselves doesn't recommend that being used because things have changed since then. But my outcome there was very clear. It was like a 92.6% match for the Opportunities Party. But then the second one that I did, I think it was the second one, which just, it didn't do that quadrant thing. It just had a ton of different like housing, immigration, economics, education, and so on and so on. And that one was weird because it came out like New Zealand first as a like 80%-ish match, which would be considered quite a like right of centre, I think, by New Zealanders. But then Labour as the next one, which of course is going to be coded as the standard mainstream left party, and then the Opportunities Party again. It's just, and that's going from one website saying 92.6% match with the Opportunities, and then this one saying 66% match, which is not a high match at all. It suggests much more difficulty like classifying all of my weird preferences and beliefs. So yeah, I think maybe these services work best for people who just use one of them and believe in it. Because if you're then trying to start cross-referencing and noticing that you're getting very different results, yeah, maybe that's a bit confusing as to what the like eventual upshot actually is. But my approach is like, you can't do much better than that. Like we all care about a complex bundle of things, and you just need to go in and see like who in a representative democracy is going to do best on the patchwork of things that you care about. And maybe only if you've got really strong views about one particular issue, then you can skip some of that hassle and just look at who's doing the best on that issue. So let's go to you. Like you say you're right wing but radical. So why right wing, I guess, to start?
Yeah, I come at this from a very different approach, which is interesting in itself. And if opportunity presents, I'd like to explore a bit more kind of why you employed this method. It's really interesting. And I've done one of those sort of questionnaire type things in the past, but for the life of me, I can't remember where it stuck me on the quadrant. So I come at this from a different perspective. So the reason why I say I'm right wing is for two reasons, really. One is what I would call intellectual honesty. The other one is, if you like, sociological convention. And the intellectual honesty bit is, and this is where it gets a little complex, because I've been in two different parts of the right, because I've undergone a pretty profound conversion, as you know. But I was previously a conservative and influenced particularly by the thought of the American conservative intellectual, or man of letters, as he's described himself, Russell Kirk, and he thought of himself as being on the right. He used the term conservative. In fact, he did more than anyone else, arguably, to revive that whole term and tradition in the US. His entire reception is on the right. There's no one I've encountered on the left that reads him, knows who he is, likes him. So from the moment I fell in love is too strong a way to describe it, but from the moment I got into his thought and it resonated with me, from that moment I called myself a conservative and realised I was on the right. And I just felt that was the intellectually honest thing to do. I'm influenced by this guy. I already shared a lot of his views, and then he developed my thought.
Would you
And
say
then,
something, sorry to interrupt, but just
no,
like
go
a
ahead.
very brief kind of paragraph maybe about like what is it that really spoke to you in the principles or the ideology of this person? Or just so people have an idea of what is some of the content of that
Yeah,
idea?
what I liked about him was he thought, and I now question what on earth this means, but at the time it appealed to me. He thought conservatism was the negation of ideology, and conservatism was the exercise of prudence from a couple of fixed principles that weren't too detailed, so that there was a flexibility so they could be applied to the changing, evolving circumstances of society. And I found the principles attractive, and I found the method attractive. And I, at the time, was very anti-ideology, or at least in one sense of the term, as different senses. Now I would actually describe myself as ideological, but not necessarily in the way that Kirk meant. And Kirk was the great sort of 20th century expositor and popularizer of Edmund Burke, and we've both had a discussion about Edmund Burke in the past. So if you want to know about the content of his thought, it's very Burkean in that sense. But then for reasons too involved to get into in this particular conversation, late last year I had a pretty profound conversion to libertarianism.
Okay.
And then the figure that I really fell for and became very influential and really changed my thought was Ludwig von Mises. But the interesting thing is, again, he, like Russell Kirk, although totally different, would have thought of himself as being on the right, particularly after he moved to America in 1940. His reception is completely on the right.
Yeah.
If anything, he's better known and more loathed by the left, because he's held to be one of the odious figures responsible for neoliberalism and defending free market capitalism and the like. I'm actually more interested in his social thought than his economic theory. So again, because these two major influences on my intellectual development, my political philosophy over the last 10 years have been on the right, as I thought of themselves, their reception's on the right. Everyone left and right would put them on the right. It just would seem absurd to sort of say I'm not on the right when I've been profoundly influenced by them. And then the sociological aspect, which is easy to dispense with quickly, if we forget about the intellectual figures and the philosophical assumptions and the conceptual stuff, and we just looked at the kind of policies I'm in favour for, and then you market tested them with just a group of average citizens, although some of those libertarian views might be identified with the left, still I think 90 to 100% of those people are going to put me on the right, which speaks to just the conventional function of that term right in terms of policy preferences. So, for example, I do think free market capitalism, in spite of its imperfections, is really the best economic system we have, and I would like to see it much more unhampered and a lot less government intervention. It's hard to think or find people on the left that have that optimistic a view.
Yeah, although I was going to say, I guess there's a fight on over libertarianism, right? So take your point that the particular theorists that you are inspired by of the libertarians would tend to be classified or have the reception on the right. But I guess there's a sense in which if that's the ideology you feel most strongly drawn to now, and there are left-wing libertarians, there's some sense in which you're now you now could cross the centrist line, because it depends what you end up thinking within that intellectual framework, and maybe you end up being drawn to other figures that still kind of meet some cluster of the core libertarian principles, but then end up kind of thinking of themselves and classifying themselves more leftwards. I'm just saying that because I read that book, The Individualists, which like tells a very, maybe what you would say is a bit generous story about libertarianism, but in terms of like you have some 8 or 9 commitments, but all the people who have self-identified with that label through time, they adopt different of those commitments as the thing that's most important to them. So you get these different like mosaics of those commitments in different figures over time and now, and then you can get your typical like left-right division even within that ideology. And I found that really interesting.
Yeah, the Individualists, if I'm not mistaken, that's the one written by Zwolinski and Tomasi, who are both
Exactly, yeah.
who both self-identify as left left-leaning or so-called bleeding heart libertarians, although I think they do a pretty good job in that history. In my own case, there's no doubt that I have exchanged some social views and some policy areas like foreign policy and even migration, which are now more left than they were when I was a conservative. But what I find is that the weight in libertarianism is well to the right. And so certainly in Australia, and my sense is in America too, although I'm less directly acquainted with it, because one of the things that's happened is I'm now plugged into libertarian circles. And that's one of the reasons why I say radical, because not only my own views now commit me to a much more radical reshaping of social, economic and political order than they did as a conservative, which is much more a rearguard action against altering the status quo. But I'm now hanging out with anarcho-capitalists, and although, because I'm a Misesian, I'm a Minicus, I think you do have to have a government, although it would really just focus on defending negative liberty and some other things. So now I find myself in a tribe with people who want to remove the state altogether, and they're deadly serious, and I've read a lot of the work underpinning that from Rothbard, who of course was a student of Mises, although there are a lot more differences than his followers recognise. And so in a way I kind of feel now I'm at the most radical part of the right, and these people are militantly against the left, the anarcho-capitalists. You do find some who will claim they're neither left nor right, but in my experience, when you poke around, like they're militantly anti-woke. What you do find is arguments based on the work of Hans Hermann Hoppe, a student of Rothbard, that they can be anti-immigration based on property rights. So, you get to choose who can access your property, including the common property that we've all paid for as taxpayers.
Yep.
In the kind of compromised state where we live in a state-based society. And in the US, the right wing of the libertarians, you'll find like MAGA supporting Trump lovers, which I don't understand myself. But so I think the weight of the mass in the libertarian movement or intellectual milieu is well to the right, and a really radical right. The anarcho-capitalists are much more dominant than I realised going in both Australia and America.
Maybe it's worth clarifying again. I'm not totally sure on the audience, but because there can be some ambiguity in how people hear the word radical, right? And this shows up in feminism as well. Like you get a lot of people just talking like they hear the word radical feminist, for example, and they think that just means extremist. So there's a sense in which you risk when you say you're a radical anything, like self-labeling as just like the ones with the most extreme outlier views of the thing. And from some of what you just said, maybe that's not so inaccurate because it is a kind of minority viewpoint. But I think the thing that you said earlier was helpful, that like radical tends to be contrasted with reformer, right? So it's about an approach to the pace and magnitude of social change. The radicals want like big, like revolutionary, abrupt or whatever social change. And that must be interesting for you as someone previously conservative, at least given that a lot of the way that people try to articulate what it means to be conservative is precisely the opposite of being a radical. It's like conserving and going slow and making sure you're not about to make a big dramatic mistake. And so is that distinction helpful for you, or does it actually, in your case, not amount to being as important as it might be in like the radical feminist case, where we're not actually extremists, we just we don't like whatever, at the time they didn't like a lot of how the status quo was and they really wanted like dramatic change.
I think what you're rightly highlighting is the ambiguity of the word radical and the fact that it can have different senses within different political traditions, both intellectual and in terms of their political action and activity. The reason why I have used the word radical is I'm using it in the sense of the distance from the existing order to the envisaged or desired order. And in that sense, even my Misesian Minicism, I have kind of, to my surprise, as I've undergone this conversion, I realise commits me to the kind of change that is is far deeper and more, dare I say it, radical than, say, the social democratic side of the centre-left, say in the
What-
context of the Labor Party. It really is more in the vein of the Greens in terms of, not that it shares its policies, but just in the sense, the level of its dissatisfaction with the status quo and desire to move society to something that for the average person would really feel like quite a radical change.
But so I think it's worth pushing on this a little bit, because distance between like the status quo and a desired ideal need not say anything about like how abrupt change should be or by what procedures it may happen, i.e. revolution. And I think that maybe those two things get mixed up, at least when we think about like left radicals. So I have a very utopian view of what like what does the feminist future look like? It's very different from now. But I would still think, so then on the way you've just told it, I might define myself as a radical because my utopia is so far from the status quo. Still, you would need to ask me whether, do I want to ban everything now using government force? Do I want an armed uprising? Like, do I want it to be different tomorrow if I can make that happen? So, yeah, are you committed to more about the pace of change and the methods of change as well, or is it just about this gap between the ideal and the status quo?
For me, it's about the gap, and just to elaborate this a little bit in the context of libertarianism, because people misunderstand this, particularly with the anarcho-capitalists, which illustrates this point
Yeah.
really better than any other. I mean, they have a really radical, they have a revolutionary vision for what society should be. But like all libertarians, they're absolutely committed to non-aggression and non-coercion.
Right.
So that locks them, and they're quite conscious about this, into a peaceful move to this on the basis of persuasion,
Yeah.
perhaps getting into power through the democratic process, although you will find anarcho-capitalists who think it's illegitimate to participate in the democratic process because then you're kind of reinforcing Leviathan. So there is this kind of, in practice, it ends up being a more incremental, slow, long-term vision. And in my case, and it's easier for me as a minicus because I do think there's a legitimate role for government and coercion in the case of self-defense and, imprisoning people for murder and rape and those kind of things, and possibly even some low taxation to have a defense force and the like. So you have to, I think everyone in this camp, and I'm not just talking theoretically here, that the people I know involved in politics realise, particularly in the context of Australia, where the libertarian narrative would be this is a status society, we like big government, our government actually intervenes in not just the market but our personal lives in all kinds of ways, and in fact on one account it's growing and encroaching further and further, so they know there's like a mountain to climb. We don't have that tradition of liberty like America, so even the term libertarian is really poorly understood or known in Australia. So they are in practice incrementalists.
Right.
So you're right in the sense of, in terms of their political action, it's not radical at all. But I'm thinking in terms of the
vision.
the vision, the intellectual side, I think
Yeah.
it is a useful term for
Yeah.
distinguishing it from what I would regard as centre-left and centre-right perspectives, which in Australia would be, the sort of social democracy of the Labor Party, the sort of small L insipid liberalism of the Liberal Party, and the conservative part of the Liberal Party. Yeah, they all have reform agendas, but on top of what is a kind of consensus about the general order.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
But Holly, I want to come back to this initial point about, so I explained my connection to the right in a totally different way that you did.
Yes.
I mean, I don't believe for a second you needed these programs to tell you exactly what you were. It kind of feels like more like a kind of research experiment. And I understand if you like, the validity of that, because what you're doing is seeing how other people, including those that set up these systems, and you've really, in a way, you've tested your views according to the conventional
usage of the term left, right, authoritarian, whatever. So why did you go in that direction? And I mean, if I'm right, if you hadn't have undertaken that exercise, how would you have answered the question?
So I think the thing that's underlying our two different approaches is like whether we think of left and right, whether we endorse the idea of a political spectrum in principle or ideology terms, right? And then whether, if we think there's an ideology, we want to articulate where we are in virtue of those principles or that ideology. And so it makes perfect sense on the ideological approach that you mentioned, the figures that you are influenced by and how the different influences have changed how you locate yourself. I have a skepticism based on some recent thinking about how feminism fits into the left-right political spectrum. I have some skepticism about the idea of an ideological political spectrum, about whether the ideas of left and right, or even more fine-grained like the left, the right, the libertarians, the far right, the far left, whatever, whether that really has any meaning or utility anymore. And so the reason I took the approach I did was, if I take a sort of skeptical or nihilistic stance on the ideology principle question and just think all there is political parties, then all I can do is take my convictions and my social issues that I care about, and at least the things I've done much more research and thinking about, so maybe I'm better informed on the voluntary assisted dying debate and worse informed on nuclear or whatever, but the things I care about I can plug in and I can just see which parties are doing well. And in that sense, I think you might be wrong when you say, I didn't really need to do that, because like I know I'm a leftist with a few heretical opinions. No, actually, I think like it could turn out that like if these websites said, God, you've been thinking of yourself as a leftist for a long time, maybe just for these knee-jerk reasons to do with other people in your echo chamber and your social networks who you have similar views to, who you all think of yourselves as left-wing, but it turns out the party for you is New Zealand First or whatever, like, then I probably would have to do a bit of self-identity recalibrating. So maybe it turns out I've just been delusional about being left-wing for the last 5 years and I'm actually a centrist now. Or maybe I'm a conservative now. And that would be fine for me, because I think once I've like taken this sort of more skeptical view of there being an ideology, why should I care? I mean, next election I might be something else entirely. And that also means I need it less for my self-conception, right? And in a way, that's been part of my like evolution in thinking about the Where Does Feminism Fit In project, because I've come to have like a little, I don't even know if I should admit that, but I've come to have some level
You have to now.
yeah, I have to now. I've come to have some level of disdain, I think, for the identity leftists, the people that are so attached to this idea of their own left-wingness, and really what they seem to mean by that is we are the goodies and they are the baddies. We are the morally righteous. We are in possession of the moral truth. We care about people and they don't. We want welfare and they want deaths, and they want refugees to suffer, blah, blah, blah. It's like, it's so stupid and self-congratulatory. And I feel very alienated from that. Yeah, so maybe that's just to say, yeah, my approach, my empirical approach is driven by a sort of skepticism about doing it any other way. And so I guess maybe that throws a challenge to you, right? Which is, say it turns out that a lot of other people who think of themselves as right-wing or as libertarians or whatever the terms were that you've identified with over time, and it turns out you all mean different things, or over time there's no consistency in what has been meant by that. Does that shake your confidence in using those labels? Like, wouldn't it just be better to say, oh, I'm a follower of Russell Kirk, or like,
That is a really good question, and I will answer it. But I also want to come back, because I have a couple of observations about what I'm hearing from you that are really interesting. So you're absolutely right. Part of my conversion was the realization that
being a Kirkian conservative, and I did try to always use the adjective as a way of qualifying that really I was a follower of Russell Kirk. I mean, part of the problem is no one's heard of him in Australia. And even in an American context where he's really well known, it doesn't necessarily elucidate anything for those who are hearing the term. But the fact that I had that instinct and felt the need to say I was a Kirkian conservative showed even in the early stages of my embrace of the term conservative, I was conscious
Yeah.
that there was some tension there with what that word meant in the minds of other described or identified conservatives. Part of my conversion to libertarianism was over a number of developments over the years where I was a conservative and just realising, look, the term is becoming so degenerate
Yep.
and so far from its origins. I mean, in a way, I was an uber conservative going back to this guy that founded or helped found the conservative movement in America in the
Right.
1950s.
An originalist
Now,
sort of thing.
now
Yeah.
we're in the age of Donald Trump, where like evangelicals are embracing his right-wing populism. You know, up is down, down is up, left is right, right is left. Everything's confounded, and I found myself increasingly in opposition or really intellectual tension with where the right was developing. And then, of course, I think the COVID experience was the thing that just, having gone through that experience, and I was an early critic of lockdowns or skeptic, and I just think the whole thing that radically undermined my faith in the government and made me re-examine. I should just say I'd always been reading libertarian, I've always been interested in libertarian philosophy, so it was not like I was some stranger. That was my kind of dialectic with conservatism, because they're the natural dialogical partners, because they're kind of both on the right, but they have these differences of principle. So that's definitely a factor, and there is that possibility again with libertarianism. But also, I'm the kind of person who could undergo a conversion because I've undergone it before. Because I am when I said I was ideological, that's being influenced by Mises, but just in the sense that I think everyone is ideological. It's just that the average person has a kind of inchoate, inconsistent ideology that's formed just by breathing the cultural air or what education they had. They have a bunch of ideas. It might be a bit left, a bit right, a bit up, a bit down. Then you have intellectuals, and I would describe myself as an intellectual. And if you're an intellectual who's interested in political philosophy, often you're going to be able to articulate a more coherent political vision that has a set of concepts and principles that are networked, and you're going to be able to tie yourself to a tradition and explain where you got some of these ideas and how you may have developed these ideas. There are things I disagree with about Mises. Some of his ideas I've developed because, I mean, he was born in 1881 and died in 1973, for example. This is not for this discussion, but I am a methodological individualist because I've been philosophically very influenced by Mises, and he was a methodological individualist. So one part of me wants to just question these whole broad brush categories. Strictly speaking, you need to just take individuals. So I could just describe myself as a Misesian liberal. He described himself as a liberal in the sense of classical liberal. That would be the most accurate, and in a way, every instinct in me wants to do that. But of course, then you have the problem of Misesian. What? Like, what's Misesian? And no one can understand it. And this would be my argument about the utility of left and right is, yes, they can be questioned, and everyone's got a new schema, and sophisticates like academics, have a sort of 100-fold quadrant that goes into the fine-grained texture of all this stuff. But the language is so embedded, which is remarkable given it goes back to the French Revolution. And yes, it evolves and changes, but people use it all the time. And our political discourse in the media uses left and right. And so it's kind of, how do you, if you become too unique, no one understands what you're talking about. And I fear that it kind of deals you out of the conversation because you become unintelligible.
Yeah, I guess to me, it just seems like you're maybe just doing two completely different things. Like the academics who have some understanding of like the original person who put this theory forward and articulated it in the most persuasive way relative to the next guy to come along and try to refine it. As you say, like absolutely no one in the world knows about that except for you and your 5 cronies or whatever. Like that's not what anyone in the commentariat talking about left and right means. And so there is a question of whether like the people who understand more what the complexity of all these things is, and that like that contemporary politics uses these terms in a way that builds tribes, creates hatred, and polarizes people. Maybe we have a responsibility as academics to completely repudiate that practice. And then it's good that you're saying, okay, I'm a von Misesian whatever, and yeah, I get that you don't get what that means, that's fine. Like, or I'm a person who really cares about, and then you tell what it is. Like, I love capitalism and I want more of it or something. Like, yeah, but don't. I think there is a strong case to be made for like, society is conducting enormous amounts of bullshit that's bad for people under the labels left and right. And the more that, I mean, this is just the argument in the Myth of Left and Right, the Lewis and Lewis book that came out, I think, last year or the year before, that like we should not let people delude themselves and others by using language that suggests that their positions are ideological. And like, so we should make a contribution to that project by like, no one is left wing or right wing unless all you mean by that is I vote for the Republicans, or in Australia, I vote for the Liberal Party, or whatever else it is. Like, it can only ever mean political party. And you like then have to tell a story about why you're voting for that party. Like what ties you to them? And is it just because that's what your family's doing and that's what your friends are doing? Or is it because there's some issue that they're really good on, but if they stopped being good on it, you would switch to another party? So I do think we should take seriously that like, it doesn't really matter if I tie myself to some extremely sophisticated left-wing thinker and then I go around declaring that I'm like a Scanlonian left something or other. That, am I left-wing in the sense that the whole of Australia means? No, maybe, because there's no such thing. And let's all stop believing in that thing. So we can stop like all each having our own separate secret ideology that we mean when we talk about left, but doesn't track to like any party that's like coded as left or tracks for completely different reasons. Yeah, and maybe my motivation is really the like reducing political polarization, hatred, antagonism, like in-group, out-group behavior. Like I find that really, it's terrible for social cohesion and good conversations and getting to the heart of really complicated issues, like we've mentioned a few already. Like the nuclear discussion is extremely difficult. We just need to start having that discussion, and it's not a left-right thing. It's a like balancing risks of huge catastrophes and harms to future people and desperate needs for energy and poor people. And like we just need to talk about that stuff. We don't need to talk about like whether it's attached to Donald Trump and therefore like baddie stuff.
That might be possible in the stateless utopia of the anarcho-capitalists, but as long as there's a government and a big government and elections in order to put representatives in Parliament or Congress, if you're in the US with the presidential race, then I think you inevitably have parties form naturally.
Yeah.
And I think these terms end up, I think, because here's the question I was thinking about, just to digress, but I'll come back, it's relevant. And I'd be very interested in your views, because I don't know the answer to this question. But of all the questions this prompted in me, just kind of thinking about this like you, these binary left and right, is it staying power? So it's over, we've used this language in this kind of oppositional binary sense for over 2 centuries. And yet it's still so deeply embedded. Everyone has some conception of left and right. They could start to populate a bit of content or at least tell you which political parties are left and right. There is this kind of hegemonic discourse, and that in a way forces people into these identities.
Right.
The reason why I was going into the political parties and the role of government is I wonder if the only explanation I can think of is that if you're going to have a contest for political power, I think you're going to have parties. They're going to be in opposition. So it's kind of useful to have a left and right. I mean, the language is conventional. It could be the green team and the blue team, or
Yes,
the
exactly. That's the point. Of course, you're right that there will always be parties for representative democracy. Of course, you're right there will always be antagonism, and maybe there should always be antagonism because it's a way of doing checks and balances. But if Team A completely switches its issues with Team B over time, there's absolutely no point using language that suggests ideological continuity over the decades. And that, I think that's the thing that Lewis and Lewis are really challenging, because it's like it lets people believe in an ideology where there isn't one there, and that leads to really bad political decision making, because we should just get like what the most people in a democracy care about. That's the stuff that should end up being like policy. But then it's not, because there's all this distortion going on about the tribalism of my allegiance to the left, which is based on nothing except for all this weird discourse. So I am quite convinced by that it's like, let's just start calling it Team A and Team B, or blue team, red team, or just the names of the parties. And let's, like you say, you've got these strong principled commitments and a sense of the utopia. That's totally fine. At a great dinner party, you can chat about all that and say it doesn't match up well with any party, and that's a shame. And maybe we should start a party that would represent some of those principles. But yeah, don't ever let ourselves get sucked into the like, we the good left, like, or we the smug right, or whatever.
I mean, look, the terms are clearly conventional, and in one sense, their semantic content is extremely fluid and flexible, because you're right. Not only do they swap positions over time, but they swap constituencies. So that, you know, once upon a time, Catholics in Australia voted for Labor. Now they overwhelmingly vote for the Liberal Party. In the US, the Republican Party's become the party of the working class. The Democrats are the class of the wealthy elite, or, you know, professional class, I should say. So these things change, but there is one important, I think, the historical continuity and longevity of the language is because it serves that oppositional function is meaningful, which you need, because it's not just that there's antagonism in politics, obviously, but you need some way of signifying that so that people get the point that we're the left, we're the right. And yes, the language could change just because all language is conventional anyway. But just to come back to one thing I said earlier, because I'd be interested in what you think about this, and you can respond to the...
But can you remember where you're going next? Because I just want to challenge that. Like, you can...
Oh, well, just challenge away then. I'll come back to the other thing.
Because you can preserve opposition without distorting what is true by suggesting false continuity. So I don't understand how this is a response. Like, yes, to the antagonism that we need, that's helpful for many ways, but there's nothing about that suggests that we should call one of those things the left, and that it's okay that that's persisted through time, because the fact that it's persisted is extremely misleading, and that's politically harmful. So
that's exactly where I was going to go, actually. I was going to defend my own use of the term in a historical sense, because you've helped me realise that that's actually unusual, in that I'm more historically literate of the genealogy of political ideas attached to, say, the right in my case, than obviously the general public is going to be. But I, as someone with a kind of historical sensibility, and this is the conservative part of me, I have not abandoned all of my conservative views. You know, I'm very conscious of the intellectual history of the ideas that I have embraced, and they can be traced through this larger category, if you like, of the right. Now, the problem for me is I'm in the tiny, tiny number of people who are conscious of that historical continuity and are looking at it like an intellectual historian rather than a political activist. But in some ways...
intellectual continuity. It's about what, like, take the Republican Party in the US or the Liberal Party in Australia. What is their continuity over time? Nothing. So it's not about whether you can trace a principled academic journey from von Mises onwards. It's about whether the things that call themselves the right have any like unifying principle to tie all their issues together, and whether this iteration has anything to do with the 5 years ago iteration or the 50 years ago. And the argument from the political scientists, which I think is like getting more and more support, is like there's just nothing. So I don't know why you're making recourse to this idea that you could do it. Who cares? Like it's.
Well, I think it's. I think we should avoid conflating what I would call the political actors and the political thinkers, because they're not necessarily even connected. So,
True.
sure, I totally agree with you on the political parties. I wouldn't. I'm really not even interested in their intellectual continuity, because I'm interested in political ideas and the thinkers. And so, it goes. There's a fork in the road for someone like me. So I'm influenced by the thought of, say, Ludwig von Mises, right? And part of his project is reviving and revitalising and refining 19th century liberalism in the context of 1920s Austria, and then eventually he ends up in the US and has a second reception there. And now I don't think identically to him, but this is where I'm different. So I'm not sort of your policy person in the Liberal Party who has no interest in where the ideas come from, and they're probably driven as much by the opposition to the other party as anyone else. This is why I emphasise the word intellectual honesty, in the sense that, yeah, I could pretend that these are just my ideas and I came up with them and try and appropriate them and repurpose them. But I'm not saying anyone should care. I'm just saying I feel, as someone who's kind of got a historical perspective on the intellectual history of these political ideas, and the fact that the genealogy of libertarianism and conservatism is on the right. It doesn't really bleed over into the left that much. And you could tell the same story about Marxism, right? So Marx is a 19th century thinker. There are all these different Marxisms. It depends what era and what place and the ideas develop. But when someone says today I'm a Marxist or Marxian, aren't they alluding to the fact that they are part of a historical tradition that has this kind of diachronicity that goes back?
No, of course they are, but that's not the point. The point is like what does the academic staff have to do with the current political staff? And I think the answer is nothing. And now you've just got to fight. Who deserves the word right? Is it Jonathan Cole, because he knows the intellectual tradition and can tell a coherent story about this ideology, even if the ideology has absolutely nothing to do with the Republicans? Like, okay, maybe you win and you get the word, but then everyone else in the world that uses the word right wing, whether for themselves or for their enemies, is wrong. Okay, maybe that's fine. Or maybe you don't deserve the word. You should just talk about the ideas that you subscribe to and their tradition and what's continuous over time. And all the pundits should keep using the word right, but we should all develop our understanding to know that that just means Republicans. Like, it never means anything other than Republicans. And there's no intellectual traditional continuity there. That is literally just a tribe that could pick up a completely different set of issues for the next election, and all we could count on is that they would be antagonistic to the ones in the other team. Like, so do you see what I mean? It's like, I feel like we're just fighting at cross purposes if it's like, but the academics somehow have a prior claim because they have the originary story, or they can tell a better story about the ideology or whatever.
Mm-hmm. That there are discontinuities through the historical evolution of these terms in the thought, but not absolute discontinuity. That's
Are you
so.
talking about now the academic tradition or the political usage?
No, I'm talking about say an intellectual who's influenced by thinkers historically identified by, they self-identified, their reception is attached to this thing called the right. What you find is not a radical break in discontinuity. So you'll still find lots of continuity in their ideas. You may even find people, they will give a nod to the names of these figures as being, yes, they're important, they're our kind of tribal demigods. I've never read them, but I know Burke is the great conservative guy, and I'm sure what he said was wonderful if I ever bothered to read it. But you'll find continuity. It's just that the tension here is that there is important points of discontinuity, but I would argue enough continuity. This is why I keep emphasising this point, intellectual honesty. Yeah, you could rebrand if you wanted for political purposes, and that may be efficacious in terms of branding and garnering a new basis of support, particularly if there are negative associations with what has happened. And I think some anti-Trump Republicans are more or less attempting that. It's a bit the kind of stranglehold of the two-party system there makes it very difficult for minority parties. But Australia has a plethora of minority parties for those who are dissenting, but they channel all their preferences to the right or left, depending on if they're to the right or left of the ALP and the Liberal Party. So there's more continuity than I think you're allowing for. But I take your point in terms of that there is this decision about do you reinforce the left-right binary with all of its negative implications for polarization? And I accept that's a consideration. I think you're right about that. Or do you go the other direction? And I think I can see pros and cons with both. I guess I'm just looking at as like often it's just our innate temperament and genetics doing the work. Often, I think here, and so maybe this is just the personal kind of Jonathan Cole preference is, for whatever reason, I think the historical genealogy is important. Maybe I'm the only person in Australia that does, and for my sins then I have to be tarred and associated with everything that is evoked by the term right. Whereas you have the luxury of being a bit more flexible, which interestingly this is the interesting contrast here, Holly, is where I kind of feel committed for whatever strange reason to identify myself with the right, whereas I found it very interesting the way you said that you don't really care whether it's green, blue, up, down, left, right.
Yeah.
If that's where the kind of views sit, then you'll sit. And it doesn't sound like you're as worried about the sort of historical angle. And
Because I don't think there is one. That's why.
well, I
Or a point that like you think there is continuity, so at least you can defend that there is some ideology, even if you cede that it has nothing to do with the parties that call themselves right. I think I'm skeptical about that, but you've read more of it, so if you think you can make a case, you can. I think it's very clear that you can't make a case on the left because there's just been a huge shift. Like, how would you possibly explain a shift from Marxism to obsessive identity politics? That's nothing. Like, there's nothing that can tell a unifying story about that. So, yeah, skepticism about what story anyone can tell about an underlying ideology, and then the thing that really matters here, I think, is any connection from that ideology to the actual politics that makes use of these terms in order to like build tribes and get people to vote.
Totally. This brings me back to something I flagged early on. In that first segment where you spoke, there was an issue I wanted to return to because I kind of hypothesis popped into my head I wanted to put to you, which was I wonder if part of what explains your approach, and we have kind of different methodological assumptions underpinning the way we look at this issue. I mean, it seems to me that your kind of primary theoretical lens, intellectual tradition identity is feminism, right? It's not in the first instance a left or a right thing or a whatever. And so I wonder whether with the complexities of the feminist tradition of thought, its movement, its evolving views as new issues raise up, because you kind of talked about how you could tell a utopian story about a future society in which women are treated or have a role in the way that you would like to see that is not the status quo. And I wondered whether perhaps one reason for, I just try to use this descriptively, a kind of ambivalence about whether it's left or right or whatever. But let me put it this way, like if your feminist views ended up being on the right, my sense is it wouldn't bother you because the driving thing's the feminism.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I would just note that, like, I'm a philosopher first, so I've only been working on feminism since 2018. I had no feelings at all about it before that and no real knowledge. And it's not like before when I worked on citizen responsibility for states' actions or collective action or climate ethics, I had any strong feelings about making sure my philosophical ideas were appropriately left-wing or whatever. Like, I think I've been for a lot of my life bored by real politics, if I'm honest. I find it extremely difficult to care about the people and the minutiae of the arguments. I find all the terminology alienating and annoying. Like, what is a capital gains tax? I don't know. I still keep looking up what fracking is every month. Like, I
Fringe
don't,
benefits.
I just can't like get interested enough in this stuff. And so maybe that's part of it. And I think I was just very lucky that where I grew up and where I went to uni, at the time I did all that stuff, no one built this stuff into their identity. Like, I never met people being these kind of morally righteous, sanctimonious leftists. I've probably met that phenomenon in the last 5 years. Somehow I just managed to escape that behavior, or maybe that behavior has just become a real thing lately and it wasn't before. So I just think I have always tried to like approach the philosophical questions afresh, draw on whatever thinkers have interesting ideas. I've never really felt beholden. It's not like I'm a Rawlsian and so everything has to be done in a Rawls lens. No, I'm just, this is an interesting question. Let's see what can be said about it. What are the good objections? And so I've taken that approach to feminism. And so you're sort of right in the sense that like the thing I currently am like really intrigued by is feminism and women's issues. And then I can have a sense of what that utopia looks like or what political change would look like. And it's just a matter of like, which parties are going to end up like being the most conducive to that, or we write a bill, which parties can we get to get that bill through? It's all just a strategic question. But I'm not, it's maybe just not quite true that like, well, because that's the only thing I really care about, or that's the thing that I put first, that allows me to be more flexible. I think I was just more flexible or disinterested all along, and that's had a protective effect somehow. Yeah.
That is really interesting, and I would. You've just dropped some really interesting things that if we had another 30
But I
minutes,
don't know what fracking is.
I would. Well, yeah. Who knows what fracking is? You know, I agree. There's just all this technical argot in politics that
Right.
is
alienating.
just makes you fall asleep.
Yeah.
But I would love on another occasion perhaps to investigate a little more this recent feminism thing. I didn't realise. I thought maybe, for all I knew, it was a 20-year-long kind of
Oh, right. No, yeah.
thing. It would be interesting to look at that. But then it also makes me wonder, you know, you must have a set of presuppositions or assumptions about reality, ontological assumptions, some view of the cosmos or of social phenomena or some anthropology that must inform your perspective. And we don't have the time to
have a scientific worldview, but I think beyond that, I'm not sure. And maybe this is a philosopher's thing, right? We have like sort of empty heads in the sense that like we're in a tradition, like analytic philosophy. We have certain commitments, like empirically informed scientific worldview, valuing capital T truth, no patience for relativisms and knowledges. But beyond that, it's pretty open. And maybe that's the like, yeah, the brains are so, what is it? Got a mind so open your brain fell out or whatever. It's like, yeah, my answer to everything. Yeah, maybe. So maybe that's, you have more convictions than me or something, and that like takes you to a more strong sense of where you're located, or gives you a stronger feeling about, I don't know if that's the right word actually, but gives you a stronger sense of like where you locate yourself, and that it's important, like it would be disruptive or something if you then found out that you're a leftist, or what?
I think I'm just swimming in more ideological waters in the sense that I'm looking at traditions of thought that are quite developed. They have their commitments, they have principles, they have a worldview. And although I've had a conversion from one to the other, they kind of function in the same way. And whereas you take a more, a more open perspective.
Or outsider, somehow it sounds like you're reading these texts like a religion almost, right? Like you're a follower.
That's probably my
of
religious
these.
background.
You said you're a follower, right? Whereas maybe I'm reading it as like an impartial spectator, like, oh, that's an interesting idea, probably wrong.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Well, maybe, and again, we're opening like 30 different episodes here, but that like in all seriousness, that's probably a figment of being raised within a religious tradition.
Right.
But Holly, we have to. We were aiming to get this in under 60 seconds. So I'm going to try and within 60 minutes. So I'm going to try and do the sign off really quick. Very stimulating conversation. I could easily do another hour, but we have to release listeners. Thanks so much for the conversation. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing and liking. If you're listening on one of the podcast apps, please follow, give a 5-star rating. Holly, do you want to say goodbye?
Goodbye. See you next time.
We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.